All right, welcome to Chapter 11, Lecture 11 for the Kinesiology 158 Motor Learning and Control class. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about scheduling the learning experience. So getting into ideas of how to distribute practice, how much work versus rest periods there should be within a practice session, between practice sessions, and even talk about things in terms of how do we practice skills and sets of skills. Should we practice them in isolation? Should we practice them all together? Some kind of interesting stuff that we cover in this section, in this chapter, without a doubt. So let's talk about practice. Without a question, the most important factor to learning is practice. You can't get good at something without practice, right? The term practice makes perfect. It's a thing for a reason, right? Because as much as perfection isn't a thing, practicing to get as close to perfect as possible is a thing. So the design of practice does need to take into consideration multiple variables. One is the scheduling of practice trials, right? Do we practice every day? Do we practice 5 times a day? Do we practice once a month? What's the optimum level of practice to utilize to maximize the learning effect? The distribution of practice trials or periods of practice need to be considered as well. How do we best utilize that distribution to ultimately lead to the most effective learning? And then we'll finish talking today about the simplification techniques for presenting skills. So when we get to really complex skills, how do we practice them? Do we simplify them and does simplifying a skill and practicing a simplified version of a skill that isn't the actual skill, does simplifying it lead to better learning? Okay, so let's talk about block versus random practice. So when we have something called inter-skill or multi-skilled practice, and the author uses the term inter-skill, which to me is a little bit, I don't know, not misleading, but just not direct. Multi-skill practice. So if you have a practice a practice session where you're trying to learn multiple skills, let's say it's 4 of them, right? A, B, C, and D. What's the best way to practice? And so we have this idea of, well, we can, the scheduling of this type of practice involves decisions regarding the goals of practice, yes, and the amount of contextual interference present within the practice schedule. And contextual interference, we'll define it more on the next slide, but contextual interference is the amount of interference provided by the way in which you practice things. So we have 2 different sort of ideas with how to practice this multi-skill practice situation. Block practice, where we take one of the 4 skills and we practice only that one, and then we practice the next skill, and then we practice the 3rd one, and then we practice the 4th. So all 4 skills are practiced separately from the other. Random practice or serial practice are pretty much the same. That is a situation where the 4 skills are interspersed or separated in different ways. And it can be completely random, or it could be somewhat in a pattern, but at least not just blocks of isolated skill practice of just one skill. So the question is, which would lead to better acquisition? So if you did a block practice or a random practice, acquisition trials, which do you think would lead to better acquisition trials? All right, you're screaming at me, block practice. Of course it does, right? You're doing the same exact thing. You know what to expect. You're repeatedly doing a free throw shot, right? I know exactly what's going to happen versus you having to take shots from different parts of the court, maybe even do a layup in there, whatever it is. That would be different, that would be a random practice kind of thing. What about retention? Yeah, so even though blocked practice is considered perfect practice because of the perfection, again, perfection is not a real thing necessarily, but because the acquisition trials during block practice are so much better than random practice, it can be very misleading. And so the retention trials do lead to, or are better under random practice situations, as is the transfer of those skills. So block practice doesn't necessarily have a very good place in the regular practicing of skills. I promised I'd define contextual interference, the degree of interference created by the ordering of skills within a practice session. So from that previous example, yeah, we had the blocked versus the random. Blocked has very little contextual interference. The ordering of skills doesn't interfere sort of the practice session, or it doesn't provide any challenge. We know exactly what to expect. We're doing each individual skill in blocks, right? So very low contextual interference with block practice. Random practice, depending on how random it is, and there are different degrees of randomness, can provide quite a bit of contextual interference. We've already asked the question, why, well, we didn't. We addressed it at least a little bit. Why does block practice equal perfect practice but not optimum performance? So what is it about block practice that is so negative in the ultimate outcome of performance? Worth thinking about on your own in this online environment. You can just pause the video, of course, so I'm just going to keep talking. But one of the ideas is that, yeah, when we do block practice, we're not forced to have to think on our feet, right? We are already able to anticipate exactly what we're going to do, and so when it comes to performance, that's not how performance works. So in the performance setting, we are almost always required to deal with a random type of situation. We're not always told, especially in the context of sport, right? What the next scenario is going to be. It just happens based on your defenders, based on the game, or whatever it is. So the blocked practice doesn't require much sort of thinking on your feet in that type of adaptation. There's something called the action plan reconstruction hypothesis that describes this effect. And it's basically saying, yeah, we have limited capacity of short-term memory, and therefore we kind of have to relearn the process of recalling those skills when we do random practice, right? Block practice, we don't have to think about anything. We know exactly what's going to happen next, so we don't have to recall any movement pattern or anything like that. We've been using it, we just keep using it. So that relearning of the skill, or at least the process and decision-making process, right? That perceptual aspect and the decision-making aspect and then the performance aspect kind of has to happen from scratch every time. And in the long term, that equals better long-term memory, better performance. So scheduling inter-skill practices. The contextual interference effects, then we want to maximize contextual interference as much as possible, right? So in beginning to advanced performers, everyone benefits from the higher level of contextual interference. Can we always throw a contextual interference type of practice at a learner? It does depend, right? And so some of the timing of the introduction of random practice factors are listed at the bottom here. So with novice learners, with people learning a skill who are really at the beginning phases, in they're in the cognitive stage of learning, maybe even physically, developmentally, they're still not quite ready yet. Block practice has its advantages, right? They get the idea of the movements, they get the idea of the environment and those kinds of things. But at some point, you want to start introducing contextual interference. And so the age, the actual learner, the task itself, so the more complex the task, the longer you might wait to introduce contextual interference. The concept of fading in contextual interference is a pretty common practice. So you start off with block practice, and then you slowly start to randomize it. It isn't just an absolute, oh, we do blocked, and then we go completely random. We go blocked, and then we kind of do maybe a serial practice schedule, which is somewhat random, but not totally random. Some ability to anticipate what's going to happen, but so there's different strategies to kind of ease into it. And actually this graphic from your text is a good one that shows from top to bottom we're going from low contextual interference to a situation of high contextual interference. And so at the very top, right, we have block practice. If we have 4 tasks, A, B, C, and D, practice task A, task B, task C, and then D, and then you're done with practice, right? So there's no decision making. Okay, you're going to do task A for 10 trials, then B for 10 trials. Then we started getting into this serial presentation. So the fading in is sort of this process of, all right, now you're going to do just A twice, and then B, and then C, and then D, and then you're going to go back to A. And so all of a sudden, you're going to have to go back to a skill that you previously practiced, which doesn't happen in the blocked practice schedule, correct? That third scenario is just a greater variation of serial presentation with a little bit of randomness in there. It's not done A, B, C, D anymore. It's done in more random blocks. And then that fourth scenario there is even sort of more random in a way, A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D. So every trial is new, even though there is predictability in what the next trial is going to be. You are switching from skill to skill. And then finally, the greatest contextual interference comes with that bottom example, which is truly random or completely random as it's labeled. You have no idea what's coming next. And so you have to pretty much start from scratch every trial and perform there. So intra-skill practice sessions is also something to consider. So if we're just practicing one skill, same skill, do we want to, what do we need to consider with that skill? And so really you can't vary the order because there's no order. You're only doing one thing. So the idea of constant practice and very varied practice needs to be addressed. And just as a side note, constant practice and varied practice can be applied to multi-skill practice or inter-skill practice as well, right? So, that previous example, we could apply constant and varied to it. Author doesn't talk about it much, but it's doable. So the constant practice is a situation where we practice something under the same conditions. Same manners, everything is constant, everything's the same. Varied practice, we change the conditions. Depending on the skill itself, maybe the environment's going to change, maybe the arrangement of defenders, or maybe the surface on which it's being played on, whatever, you're going to manipulate something, right? And so, which is best? And hopefully right off the bat you're going, well, it really depends. And you're absolutely right. It really does depend on the skill itself, the nature of the goals of the skill and all that. Generally speaking, this idea of the specificity of practice principle is the rule of thumb to follow, right? And so the specificity of practice principle is you should practice as closely as possible to what you're going to be performing. So if you are a basketball player and you're thinking, we're shooting free throws here, but maybe we should vary the practice of the free throw shot because that's the only thing you do. Your only role, let's say in basketball, if they had like in baseball, there's a designated hitter. If they had a designated free throw shooter, right? If you're that designated free throw shooter, why would you ever practice anything but free throws from the free throw line with the basket that's at the right height, right? But a potential way to vary the practice of the free throw would be to change the basket height, or to maybe be shooting in the sand, or whatever, things that are somewhat unrealistic. But hopefully it makes sense that the specificity of practice principle, if you're only shooting free throws, there's no benefit to you going back and shooting three-pointers or whatever, moving the basket. So scheduling the intra-skill practice, the target skill, so skills performed in variety of ways. So if you're not that designated free throw shooter, then what should you do? Then aim to vary things as much as possible, right? And that is still following that rule of specificity. If you are practicing a skill or learning a skill that is in varied environment or circumstances, then add that variation to the practice schedule as much as possible. So here's a graphic and the hypothetical comparison of performance curves for a skill acquired under constant or varied practice. So as you can imagine, varied practice is similar to random practice that we talked about earlier, whereas constant is a little bit more like the blocked, right? Constant, nothing changes. Blocked, nothing changes. Varied, everything's somewhat unpredictable, or at least things are changing all the time. Acquisition trials tend to lag a little bit with varied practice, but ultimately, and this is sort of practice and performance right on this graph, ultimately the potential though through varied practice is that performance will outmatch that with just constant practice. The learners are prepared for multiple situations, and in performance circumstances that will lead to a better outcome. So spacing of practice. So the idea of when we have a practice session, should we dedicate, let's say we have an hour to practice, should we dedicate that entire hour of practice of the hour session to practice, or should we maybe do 10-minute blocks, take a couple minutes off, 10-minute block, a couple minutes off? How do we distribute that balance of work and rest? And so there's two different ways to describe this: distributed practice and massed practice. Distributed practice is a situation where there's more rest. We distribute practice across that time. I don't know the best mnemonic for that one. But distributed practice, more rest throughout the session. Massed practice, we're doing more work throughout the session. There are controversies on the influences of distributed practice. Generally speaking, the ideas, or at least what the research presents, is pretty consistent, but the applications and some of the utilization of distributed practice influences are still not entirely clear. And so first we can talk about this mass versus distributed practice within a practice session. Hey, we have an hour to practice. How are we going to distribute? Is it going to be distributed or mass practice? Is it going to be a lot of rest, little work, or a lot of work, little rest? And then we can also talk about between practice sessions. How long should there be between each session? And that idea is, yeah, do we practice every single day? Do we practice twice a week, once a month? So firstly, let's talk about within session distribution effects. So distributed practice shows better acquisition performance, but there's a time constraint issue. So in other words, yeah, you can take less time of actually practicing, more time off, and acquisition performance is improved. So that's a plus. The drawback is it takes a lot longer to get to that point of better acquisition trials. Mass practice has its issues as well, right? Not so much time, it's more efficient in time, but then there can be both physiological and psychological fatigue issues, right? Depending on the skill, if it's a highly physical type of demanding skill, you could get fatigued physically. Psychological, more related skill, your brain could start hurting, right? So ultimately, between the two, the impact on learning is the same. So we're talking acquisition trials. Acquisition is ultimately not so important. What is important is performance or learning, and learning between the two is kind of the same. So why take so much time to learn something through the distributive? We can be more efficient and do mass practice. Between session distribution effects. So distributive practice also gets the thumbs up in terms of showing better outcome when we distribute practice over time. We'll talk about the Baddeley and Longman study in a second. The idea of scheduling sessions further apart in time is that there's this time for what's called memory consolidation, that we are able to sort of keep memories and solidify those memories ultimately, and then rely on them to perform later. And when practice happens too frequently in succession, there isn't enough time for that to happen. It'll happen eventually, but you're continuing to practice, and so that amount of time practice, it'll take longer to get to the same outcome if we don't have as much space between practices. So the Baddeley and Longman study was an interesting kind of thing, and your author takes some time to present the results, so you should be familiar with them. It was a study done on postal workers learning how to do some sort of typing keyboard type of task on some fancy keyboard, right? Some newfangled type of keyboard. And the way they distributed practice was pretty unique. So they had 4 different practice schedules, and all of them required 60 hours, right? And so one thing I didn't really mention is when we talk about this practice in these studies, we have to ultimately have the same amount of practice performed, right? So if you only practice 20 minutes in an hour-long session, it's the 20 minutes that we're looking at. So is practicing 20 minutes in an hour better than practicing just 20 minutes consecutively, right? So we ultimately have to have that same amount of training volume. And so the training volume in this study was 60 hours, right? So 60 hours of training. How quickly are our postal workers able to learn how to use the keyboard, and how quickly are they then able to type 80 keystrokes per minute? And so the different groups were one group that did 1 hour session once a day for 12 weeks. Another group did 1 hour session twice a day for 6 weeks, right? So a little more mass distributed, right? And then the third group did a 2 hour session, 1 session a day, also for 6 weeks, right? So the groups 2 and 3 were same volume in a sense, but they distributed a little bit differently, right? So the third group, 2 hour session, 1 session a day for 6 weeks. And then the third group, 2 hour sessions twice a day for 3 weeks. So the most of mass distributed, right? I mean, 3 weeks, they packed it in, 20 hours a week of practice, compared to the first group that only did, 5 hours a week of practice? So the results on the right there pretty much speak for themselves in terms of hours to learn the keyboard and hours to type 80 keystrokes per minute. The group that took the longest time, right, the not mass distributed group, learned the fastest, right? So hours learned keyboard, about 35, hours typed 80 strokes, 55. The group that did the 2-hour session, 2 sessions a day, never actually even got to the point where they didn't make it to the 80 keystrokes per minute. So at least that argument that, you know, the distributed practice was more effective than the mass practice. So, you know, some of the implications here, right? So this between session distribution effects, distribute practice experiences as much as possible, right? All things being equal, the longer you can wait between sessions, the better. That's so unrealistic in our world. It's worth considering, but we usually don't have that type of flexibility, right? But at least knowing that it exists, sure. Distributed practice does equal the most learning, but it also takes the most time. So, you know, hour to hour of practice, distributed's the best, but if it takes you a full year to learn how to shoot a free throw when, you know, it might take a little more actual practice time to learn it in a day, probably go for the day. So end of this chapter talks about part practice. So simplification of skill presentation. So oftentimes there's very complex skills that need to be learned, and learning those skills in their whole is sometimes too difficult for the learner. And so the idea of part practice has been looked at quite extensively. Part practice will provide a reduction in the demand to the learners learning the skill. If I can break a practice session or a skill, sorry, if I can break a skill down into individual pieces, then I might have a better chance of ultimately performing the whole skill, right? You know, and I can't think of anything off the top of my head. You know, maybe a golf swing, right? Hey, the golf swing has a whole bunch of different pieces. There's the way you stand, there's the way you grip the golf club, there's the backstroke, there's the stroke itself, there's a follow through. Can I just practice each one of those in isolation? That would be an idea of part practice. We all know how easy golf is, so maybe that's not the best example. Just kidding. So part practice has been shown to provide early success for novice learners getting the idea of movements, but it doesn't always lead to the best learning outcomes, and it's actually pretty tricky. We'll get to some of the conclusions. So there are 3 methods of part practice, so 3 different ways to do it. One is called segmentation. So you break a skill down into segments. You practice each segment separately. Again, do we do it in a blocked or a random fashion? That's usually a blocked is the idea, but you can do it randomly too. So the skill is broken down into segments. It wouldn't make sense with a golf club swing though. Okay, let's do your stance, and then do the back swing, and then do maybe the grip, and then do the follow. That just wouldn't work. I have to come up with better examples. So each segment is practiced separately, and then you start to practice them in order. The progressive part method has 2 different strategies: forward chaining and backward chaining. And they're just different ways of describing how the pieces are put back together. Forward chaining is, we start from the beginning and move towards the end. Or backward chaining is, we start with the outcome, the end of the skill, and move our way backwards to the beginning of it. So 2 different strategies to sort of put the segments back into place. Second is simplification. And this is a good example. See, the author is much better at this than I am. Simplification, simplify some aspects of practice. So some of the movement components or the environment, in this case of this t-ball player here, right? The important part for him in this case is to learn the swing, right? Let's simplify the skill and not let the ball move, right? So let's change the environment a little bit. Let's not make the perception and the timing and all those other factors involved with actually hitting the ball a factor, and let's put the ball on top of the tee. Right? So that would be an example of simplification. And then finally, fractionization. And so fractionization is practicing in isolation the components of a skill that are usually performed simultaneously. There's concerns about fractionalization. Yes, the coordination of all the movements might be lost. And so a different motor movement pattern is developed for each of the fragments, but the coordination of them isn't put together. And I used to do that, and so I highly recommend all of you to go to YouTube and Google Charles Barkley golf swing. I show it in my face-to-face class, and it's hilarious, but it's almost maybe, and I'm not exactly sure because I don't want to pick on anybody, but his golf swing is atrocious, right? And you watch it, and you could almost visualize maybe Mr. Barkley was taught in a fractionalized way how to perform a golf swing. And if you kind of visualize this fractionalization sort of concept, yeah, let's break it down and see how the outcome is. He has all the pieces of the golf swing, but he just can't put it together. And so the coordination of those movements doesn't really work. And so the author talks about an example with swimmers, but the Charles Barkley example is much more entertaining. So Google Charles Barkley golf swing. Definitely worth your time. It's hard to separate the difference between fractionization and segmentation. And so, yeah, so I won't pick on you guys too much on those because to me, they're hard ones to sort of distinguish. They're both sort of practicing in isolation the components of a skill that are normally practiced together. So, yeah, separating them isn't the easiest thing to do. So this simplification process, when to decide to use part or whole practice. Bottom line is part practice might hinder learning, so avoiding it is usually a good idea. However, there's going to be situations where it's ideal. That t-ball player is a perfect example. I don't want kids, hurling a baseball at someone and that kid's throwing is a whole other skill to develop. How close is the ball going to get to the kid, or is it going to hit the kid? So that t-ball example is great. And under the circumstances of someone learning how to swing a baseball bat and hit a baseball, that's a great time to start with sort of simplifying the skill itself. Other things to consider, right? The complexity of the skill, like how many parts are there? Can the learner successfully do them without certain fatigue, both psychological or physiological, sort of being a factor? Is the skill so complex that the level of attention needed is going to be a challenge as well? So you can focus attention, you can provide attention to one task at a time, much simpler than 10 of them strung together. So the complexity of the task is usually one of the bigger deciding or determining factors. The organization as well, and so are there multiple parts of a puzzle that need to be sort of put together? The baseball example again is a good one. If you have a batter, then you're going to have a pitcher, and there's going to be multiple sort of dependence on other parts and other skills. And the type of skill itself, right? And so how demanding is that skill and how complex is it? That will definitely play a role. All right, that's it for chapter 11. I'll see you next time.